Hello there, weary traveller, and welcome to this quiet corner of ancient history. Before we begin our journey back to a time when the world was vastly different from our own, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers, ready to drift off to sleep, or simply looking to unwind with some peaceful historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a delight to see the diverse community of history enthusiasts gathered here. And if you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from the past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss the next installment. But for now, let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time long ago when life moved at a different pace, yet was filled with challenges that would make our contemporary struggles seem almost trivial by comparison. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a dusty road in first-century Palestine. The sun beats down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, and the air shimmers with heat that seems to rise from the very stones beneath your feet. This is not the holy land of modern pilgrimage tours with air-conditioned buses and bottled water. This is the raw, unforgiving landscape where Jesus of Nazareth walked, taught, and lived among people whose daily existence was a constant battle against the elements, disease, poverty, and political oppression. As we embark on this gentle exploration of life in ancient Palestine, you'll discover that the world of 2,000 years ago was so dramatically different from our own that even the simplest aspects of daily life would pose extraordinary challenges to any modern person. From the moment you woke in the morning until you lay down to sleep at night, every single hour would test your endurance, your health, and your very survival. The reality is that the average lifespan in first-century Palestine was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. Child mortality rates were staggering, with nearly half of all children dying before their 5th birthday. Women faced the constant peril of childbirth without any modern medical intervention, and men's bodies were worn down by back-breaking labor from childhood onward. Even reaching adulthood was an achievement that many never experienced. But tonight, as we settle into this soothing journey through time, we're not here to dwell on the harsh realities alone. Instead, we'll paint a gentle picture of what life was truly like in this ancient world, understanding both the struggles and the remarkable resilience of the people who called this land home. We'll walk through their villages, peek into their homes, and witness the rhythms of daily life that shape the backdrop against which one of history's most influential figures lived and taught. Imagine, if you will, awakening in a small stone house in a Galilean village as the first pale light of dawn creeps through a narrow window opening. There's no glass in that window, just a wooden shutter that's been thrown open to let in whatever breeze might stir in the early morning air. The floor beneath you isn't smooth hardwood or comfortable carpet, but packed earth, perhaps covered with a simple woven mat if your family is fortunate enough to afford one. Your bed isn't a soft mattress with supportive springs, but rather a thin straw pallet that you share with several family members. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply doesn't exist. Extended families crowd together in single-room dwellings, with animals often sharing the same space during cold nights or storms. The gentle lowing of a cow or the soft bleating of goats might be the first sounds you hear, mingling with the stirring of your sleeping relatives. As you rise from your simple bed, your body already aches in ways that would send a modern person straight to a doctor. Your joints are stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. Your back protests from years of manual labor that began when you were barely tall enough to hold a farming tool, and your feet are already anticipating another day of walking on rocky, uneven paths without the benefit of cushioned shoes. The first task of the day is water, and this isn't simply a matter of turning a faucet. Water must be fetched from the village well, carried in heavy clay jars that strain your arms and shoulders. If you're a woman, this task falls to you, and you'll make this journey multiple times throughout the day, balancing these vessels on your head or hip as you navigate narrow, winding streets that are little more than dirt paths scattered with loose stones and refuse. The well itself is a community gathering place, but it's also a potential source of conflict. Water rights are precious in this arid land, and disputes over access can turn neighbours into enemies. The water you draw isn't crystal clear and chlorinated like what flows from modern taps. It's often murky, sometimes tinged with minerals that give it an unpleasant taste, and it may carry diseases that your body has learned to tolerate through years of exposure, though visitors from other regions might fall desperately ill from drinking it. As the sun climbs higher, the heat becomes oppressive in ways that modern air conditioning has made us forget. There's no escape from it except in the deepest shade, and even then, the air remains thick and heavy. Your clothing offers little relief. If you're a man, you wear a simple tunic made of rough woven wool or linen, perhaps with a cloak for cooler weather. If you're a woman, your garments are more concealing but equally warm, covering you from neck to ankle, regardless of the temperature. These clothes aren't washed frequently, partly because water is precious and soap is a luxury, but also because the very act of washing and drying garments is an enormous undertaking. Most people own only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, which they wear until they literally fall apart. The fabric becomes stiff with sweat and dirt, and the smell that emanates from a group of people in first-century Palestine would be overwhelming to modern sensibilities. Personal hygiene, as we understand it, is virtually non-existent. Bathing is rare, perhaps occurring only a few times a year, and then only in natural bodies of water when the weather permits. Your teeth, if you still have them, are stained and worn down from years of eating coarse grain and tough, fibrous foods. Dental pain is a constant companion for many, with no relief available, except perhaps chewing on certain herbs that might dull the agony temporarily. Your hair and beard, if you're a man, are probably infested with lice and other parasites that you've long since accepted as part of life. Women keep their hair covered not just for modesty, but also to protect it from dust and insects. Everyone's fingernails are broken and dirty from constant manual labor, and small cuts and scrapes on hands and feet are perpetually healing or reopening as new injuries occur daily. The very air you breathe is different from what we know today. In villages, it's thick with dust kicked up by countless feet, both human and animal. The smell of cooking fires mingles with the odor of animal waste, unwashed bodies, and rotting food scraps. In larger towns and cities, the air is even more oppressive, heavy with smoke from workshops where metalworkers, potters, and other craftsmen ply their trades using methods that would be considered primitive and dangerous by modern standards. Food, when you can get it, bears little resemblance to the varied and abundant diet that modern people take for granted. Your meals consist primarily of bread made from barley or wheat, if wheat is available. This bread is coarse and dense, often containing grit from the grinding stones that mill the grain. It's the staff of life, literally, and when grain harvests fail, starvation follows swiftly. Meat is a rare luxury, appearing on most tables only during religious festivals or special occasions. When it does appear, it's usually goat or lamb, tough and stringy from animals that have spent their lives foraging for sparse vegetation on rocky hillsides. Fish from the Sea of Galilee provides protein for those fortunate enough to live near the water. But even this is often salted or dried for preservation, making it nearly inedible by modern standards. Vegetables and fruits, when in season, add some variety to the diet, but the selection is limited and the quality is far from what we'd expect today. Olives and olive oil are precious commodities. Grapes are turned into wine that serves as much for purification as for pleasure, and figs provide sweetness when they can be found. But for much of the year, especially during the lean months before harvest, families subsist on little more than bread and water, perhaps supplemented with a thin soup made from whatever scraps can be gathered. The very act of eating is different too. There are no tables and chairs for most families, no individual plates or utensils. People sit on the ground or on low mats, sharing food from common bowls, eating with their hands or with pieces of bread that serve as makeshift spoons. The lack of refrigeration means that food spoils quickly in the heat, and the boundary between fresh and rotten is often blurred out of necessity. Illness, when it strikes, is both mysterious and terrifying. There are no antibiotics to cure infections, no painkillers to ease suffering, no surgical procedures to correct problems. A simple cut that becomes infected can lead to death. Broken bones often heal crookedly, if they heal at all. Diseases that we consider minor inconveniences today, a severe cold, an upset stomach, a skin infection, can become life-threatening conditions. Mental illness is interpreted through the lens of spiritual warfare. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions are seen as evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment. The treatments available are limited to prayer, exorcism, or herbal remedies that may or may not provide any real relief. Those suffering from severe mental illness often become outcasts, wandering on the margins of society with no support system beyond whatever charity their families or communities might provide. Pregnancy and childbirth represent perhaps the greatest dangers that women face. Without any understanding of sterile techniques, infections run rampant. Many women die in childbirth, and those who survive often suffer from complications that plague them for the rest of their lives. Infant mortality is so common that parents often wait years before becoming too attached to their children, knowing that death could claim them at any moment. The political climate adds another layer of tension to daily life. Palestine is an occupied territory, with Roman soldiers maintaining order through fear and violence. These aren't the disciplined, romanticized legions of Hollywood movies, but often brutal men far from home, living among a population that resents their presence. Taxes are crushing, collected by local collaborators who often add their own surcharges to line their pockets. Rebellion simmers constantly beneath the surface, and the consequences of being suspected of sedition are swift and severe. Religious life, while providing comfort and community, also comes with its own set of challenges. The temple in Jerusalem demands tithes and offerings that stretch family budgets to the breaking point. Religious laws govern every aspect of daily life, from what you can eat to how you can work, to whom you can associate with. Ritual purity requirements mean constant vigilance about what you touch, where you go, and how you conduct yourself. As the day draws to a close and darkness falls, there's no electric lighting to extend your productive hours. Oil lamps provide flickering, smoky illumination for a short time, but oil is expensive and must be used sparingly. Most people simply go to bed when the sun sets, rising again with the dawn to repeat the cycle of survival that defines their existence. The sounds of night in a first-century Palestinian village are different too. There's no hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no modern background noise. Instead, you hear the settling of animals, the whisper of wind through stone buildings, perhaps the distant howl of jackals, or the scurrying of rats and other vermin that share your living space. Every sound could signal danger: bandits, wild animals, or soldiers conducting nighttime raids. Security is a constant concern. There are no police to call, no reliable system of law enforcement beyond the arbitrary justice of Roman occupiers. Disputes are settled within families or communities, often through systems of honor and shame that can escalate minor disagreements into blood feuds lasting generations. Violence is common and accepted as a normal part of life. This is the world into which Jesus was born, the environment that shaped his early years and provided the backdrop for his ministry. It's a world where survival itself was an achievement, where suffering was expected, and where the promise of something better, whether in this life or the next, carried a weight and urgency that's difficult for modern people to comprehend. As we continue our gentle journey through this ancient landscape, we'll explore more deeply how people managed to not just survive, but create meaning, beauty, and hope in circumstances that would challenge even the strongest among us today. We'll discover the ingenious ways they adapted to their harsh environment, the social structures that held their communities together, and the spiritual resources that sustained them through unimaginable hardships. So settle in comfortably, dear listener, as we prepare to delve even deeper into this fascinating world where every day was a testament to human resilience and faith. The work that defined most people's lives in first-century Palestine would break the spirit of any modern person within days. Imagine rising before dawn, not to the gentle chime of an alarm clock, but to the urgent needs of survival that drove every moment of existence. Your hands, already calloused and scarred from years of labor, would grasp the simple tools that meant the difference between life and death for your family. If you were a farmer, which most people were, your day began with tending to animals that were as much family members as sources of livelihood. These weren't the well-fed, carefully bred livestock of modern agriculture, but scrawny, hardy creatures that had learned to survive on whatever scraps of vegetation they could find in the rocky soil. Your ox, if you were fortunate enough to own one, was probably shared with several neighbors, and scheduling its use required delicate negotiations that could make or break relationships within your small community. The fields themselves would challenge every assumption about agriculture that modern minds might hold. There were no tractors, no irrigation systems, no chemical fertilizers or pesticides. Everything was done by hand or with simple wooden tools that broke frequently and had to be repaired with whatever materials could be scavenged. The soil was thin and rocky, requiring backbreaking work to clear stones before any planting could begin. These stones weren't simply tossed aside, but carefully collected to build the terraced walls that prevented precious topsoil from washing away during the brief but intense rainy seasons. Ploughing was accomplished with a simple wooden implement, perhaps reinforced with iron if your family had the means, pulled by an ox or donkey if you were fortunate, or by human power if you weren't. The furrows were shallow and uneven, nothing like the precise rows of modern mechanized farming. Seeds were scattered by hand, with much of the grain falling on rocky ground or among thorns, just as Jesus would later describe in his parables about farming life. The constant battle against weather would wear down even the strongest constitution. Too little rain meant crop failure and starvation. Too much rain could wash away an entire season's work in a matter of hours. Hailstorms could destroy months of careful cultivation in minutes. Locusts could arrive in vast clouds that darkened the sky, devouring everything green in their path and leaving families facing desperate choices about survival. Harvest time, when it came successfully, required the entire community to work together in a frantic race against time and weather. Men, women, and children would work from sunrise to sunset, cutting grain with small hand sickles, gathering it into bundles, and carrying it to threshing floors where it would be beaten to separate the precious grain from the chaff. Every kernel was valuable, and the difference between a good harvest and a poor one could mean the difference between life and death for entire families. For those who weren't farmers, life was equally demanding, but in different ways. Craftsmen worked in small, cramped workshops that were stifling in summer and freezing in winter. A carpenter like Jesus would have worked primarily with hand tools, carefully shaping each piece of wood with patience and skill that modern power tools have made unnecessary. The wood itself was precious, requiring long journeys to find suitable trees, and every shaving and splinter was saved for other uses. Blacksmiths worked over fires that had to be constantly tended, breathing smoke and fumes that would gradually destroy their lungs. The iron they worked with was crude and impure compared to modern metals, requiring tremendous skill to forge into useful tools. A single mistake could ruin hours of work and waste materials that couldn't easily be replaced. Potters shaped clay on wheels turned by foot power, creating vessels that weren't just functional, but essential for storing the water, grain, and oil that sustained life. These weren't decorative pieces, but sturdy, practical containers that had to withstand daily use and the constant handling required for household tasks. When pottery broke, which it did frequently, the pieces were carefully saved and reused in construction or for other purposes. Women's work was perhaps even more demanding than men's, though it received less recognition. They rose before dawn to begin preparing the day's bread, a process that started with grinding grain on stone querns that required tremendous upper body strength to operate. The grinding stones, worn smooth by generations of use, had to be turned by hand for hours to produce enough flour for a single day's bread. Baking required building and maintaining fires, kneading dough with hands that were already sore from grinding, and carefully timing the baking process to avoid wasting precious fuel. The bread that emerged was dense and coarse, often containing bits of stone from the grinding process, but it was literally the staff of life for most families. Water collection and management consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. Women would make multiple trips daily to wells or springs, carrying heavy jars that strained their backs and shoulders. The paths to water sources were often treacherous, winding through rocky terrain, where a single misstep could result in a broken jar and the loss of a day's water supply. Washing clothes was an ordeal that modern washing machines have made us forget. Garments had to be carried to streams or pools, beaten against rocks to loosen dirt, scrubbed with harsh soaps made from plant ash, and then spread on rocks or bushes to dry. The process was so labor-intensive that most families owned only the minimal clothing necessary for survival. Childcare in this environment was both precious and heartbreaking. Children were economic assets from an early age, expected to contribute to family survival as soon as they were physically able. Young boys would tend flocks of sheep or goats, spending long days alone on hillsides, where wild animals and bandits posed constant threats. Girls would help with household tasks, learning the skills they would need to manage their own families if they survived to adulthood. The education that children received was minimal and practical. Most people couldn't read or write, and formal schooling was available only to the wealthy few. Knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, with children learning trades and life skills by watching and imitating their parents. The stories, songs, and traditions that shaped their understanding of the world were memorized and repeated, creating a rich oral culture that bound communities together. Medical care, when illness struck, was a mixture of folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and desperate hope. Healers in the community might have knowledge of plants and treatments that could sometimes help, but serious injuries or diseases often meant death. Broken bones were set with primitive splints, infections were treated with whatever herbs were believed to have healing properties, and pain was endured with whatever spiritual and emotional resources people could muster. The marketplace, when villages were large enough to have one, was a chaotic and sometimes dangerous place. Merchants would travel from town to town, carrying goods on donkeys or camels, setting up temporary stalls wherever crowds gathered. Prices were negotiated for everything, and the unwary could easily be cheated by unscrupulous traders who knew that most customers couldn't read or calculate complex transactions. Money itself was scarce and came in confusing varieties. Roman coins, local currencies, and barter systems all operated simultaneously, making trade complicated and sometimes contentious. A day's wages for a laborer might be a single denarius, barely enough to buy food for a small family, and finding work was never guaranteed. Transportation was almost entirely on foot, with the wealthy occasionally using donkeys or camels for longer journeys. Roads were rough tracks that became muddy quagmires in wet weather and dusty, rocky passages in dry times. Bandits haunted the more remote routes, making travel dangerous for anyone carrying goods or money. A journey that might take an hour by car today could require days of difficult walking, with travelers carrying their own food and water and sleeping under the stars. Communication across distances was slow and unreliable. Messages were carried by travelers or merchants, often taking weeks or months to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. News of events in distant places might not reach isolated villages for months, and even then the information was often distorted by repeated retelling. The rhythm of life was dictated entirely by natural cycles. Without artificial lighting, people rose with the sun and retired shortly after sunset. Seasons determined not just agricultural activities, but social patterns, religious observances, and even the possibility of travel. Winter brought isolation to many communities, as harsh weather made movement between villages difficult or impossible. Religious observance provided structure and meaning to lives that were otherwise consumed by the struggle for survival. The Sabbath offered a weekly respite from labor, though the preparation required to observe it properly was itself demanding. Festivals and holy days marked the passage of time and brought communities together, providing opportunities for celebration and social connection that were essential for mental and emotional health. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. Your birth determined your station in life, and opportunities for advancement were virtually non-existent. Peasants remained peasants, craftsmen passed their trades to their sons, and the wealthy maintained their positions through land ownership and political connections. Honor and shame governed social interactions, with reputation being perhaps the most valuable possession a family could maintain. Justice, when it was available at all, was swift and often brutal. Roman law provided some protections for citizens, but most people in Palestine were not citizens and had few rights. Local disputes were settled by village elders or religious authorities, often through systems that emphasized restoration over punishment, but serious crimes brought harsh retribution. The constant presence of death shaped every aspect of daily life. Infant mortality was so high that parents often waited years before naming children or becoming emotionally attached to them. Accidents, disease, violence, and starvation claimed lives regularly, and funeral practices reflected the reality that death was always near. Bodies were buried quickly in simple shrouds, with mourning practices that acknowledged grief while accepting the inevitability of loss. Women faced particular challenges in this society. Marriage was often arranged for economic rather than romantic reasons, with young girls becoming wives and mothers while still children themselves. Widows had few options for survival beyond remarrying or depending on the charity of relatives. Divorce was possible for men, but devastating for women, who had no independent means of support. The housing that sheltered families was basic beyond modern imagination. Single-room structures built of stone and mud brick housed extended families, with animals often sharing the same space during cold weather. Roofs were flat and made of wood, covered with clay, requiring constant maintenance to prevent leaks. Privacy was unknown, and personal space was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Furniture was minimal and functional. Most families owned little more than sleeping mats, storage jars, cooking vessels, and perhaps a low table. Possessions were few and precious, carefully maintained and passed down through generations. The concept of disposable goods was unknown, and everything was repaired, reused, and recycled until it literally fell apart. As night fell over these ancient communities, families would gather around small oil lamps or cooking fires, sharing the day's experiences and preparing for another cycle of survival. The darkness was complete and profound, broken only by starlight and the occasional flame. In this quiet time, stories were told, traditions were passed down, and bonds were strengthened that would help families endure whatever challenges the next day might bring. This was the world that shaped every person who lived in first-century Palestine, from the humblest peasant to the most learned rabbi. It was a world where survival itself was an achievement, where community bonds were essential for existence, and where hope often seemed as fragile as the morning dew that briefly refreshed the parched earth before evaporating in the relentless heat of another demanding day. The social fabric of first-century Palestinian society was woven together by threads of obligation, tradition, and survival that would feel suffocating to any modern person accustomed to individual freedom and personal choice. Your identity wasn't something you discovered or created for yourself, but rather something that was assigned to you at birth and reinforced every single day through countless small interactions and expectations. If you were born into a family of fishermen, you became a fisherman. If your father was a tax collector, that profession, along with all its social stigma, became your inheritance. If you were born a woman, your entire life's trajectory was determined by the men in your family. First your father, then your husband, and finally, if you outlived your spouse, your sons. The concept of choosing your own path, pursuing your dreams, or reinventing yourself simply didn't exist. The extended family unit was both your greatest source of security and your most restrictive cage. Multiple generations lived together, not out of choice, but out of necessity, sharing cramped quarters where personal conflicts had nowhere to hide, and privacy was an impossible luxury. Your grandfather's feuds became your feuds, your uncle's debts became family obligations, and your cousin's reputation could determine your own marriage prospects. Honor and shame governed every interaction with a weight that would be crushing to modern sensibilities. A careless word could destroy a family's standing in the community for generations. A daughter's perceived impropriety could bring such shame that her brothers might feel compelled to violence to restore the family's honor. A man's failure to defend his reputation could result in social death, making it impossible for him to conduct business, arrange marriages for his children, or even participate in religious life. The system of patronage that held society together would feel corrupt and unfair to anyone raised with modern ideas about merit and equality. Everything depended on whom you knew and what favors you could exchange. A farmer might spend his entire harvest not on feeding his family, but on gifts and tributes to wealthy landowners who could provide protection from bandits or favorable treatment in disputes. Craftsmen competed not just on the quality of their work, but on their ability to maintain relationships with influential customers who could ensure a steady stream of commissions. Debt was a constant spectre that haunted most families, and the consequences of being unable to pay were severe beyond modern comprehension. A farmer who borrowed grain to survive a bad harvest might find himself and his entire family sold into slavery if the next year's crop failed. Children could be taken as payment for their parents' debts, never to be seen again. Land that had been in a family for generations could be seized by creditors, leaving entire lineages homeless and destitute. The legal system, such as it was, operated on principles that would seem arbitrary and unjust to modern minds. Testimony from women was often inadmissible or given less weight than that of men. Social status determined not just the punishments you might face, but whether your voice would even be heard in disputes. Roman citizens enjoyed protections and privileges that were denied to local populations, creating a two-tiered system of justice that bred resentment and despair. Slavery was woven so deeply into the fabric of society that it was simply accepted as natural and inevitable. Slaves weren't just the property of the wealthy elite, but could be found in households at every level of society. A moderately successful craftsman might own a slave or two to help with his work. Even poor families might have debt slaves, people who had sold themselves or their children to pay off obligations. The lives of these enslaved people were entirely at the mercy of their owners, with no legal protections and no hope of appeal if they were mistreated. The treatment of slaves varied wildly depending on their owner's temperament and circumstances. Some were treated almost like family members, trusted with important responsibilities, and eventually granted freedom. Others faced lives of grinding labor, inadequate food, and casual violence. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable, with no protection from sexual exploitation by their masters or other members of the household. Education, beyond basic religious instruction, was available only to a tiny elite. Most people lived their entire lives without ever learning to read or write, depending entirely on memory and oral tradition to preserve and transmit knowledge. This meant that important information could be easily lost or distorted, and that most people had no way to verify claims made by those in authority over them. The few who could read and write held enormous power in this largely illiterate society. Scribes were essential for conducting business, recording agreements, and communicating with distant authorities. They could easily exploit their position, altering documents, or providing false information to illiterate clients who had no way to check their work. The ability to read sacred texts gave religious authorities almost unchallenged control over spiritual interpretation and practice. Religious life was far more complex and demanding than modern people might imagine. There weren't just the major festivals and Sabbath observances that most people know about, but hundreds of smaller rules and rituals that governed daily activities. What you could eat, when you could work, whom you could touch, how you could dress. All of these were subject to religious laws that required constant vigilance to observe properly. Ritual purity was an obsession that would drive modern people to distraction. Contact with the dead, certain animals, people with skin diseases, or even your own spouse under certain circumstances could render you ritually unclean, requiring specific purification procedures before you could participate in religious activities or even enter certain areas. For those whose livelihoods required them to work with materials or in situations that caused frequent ritual impurity, life became an exhausting cycle of contamination and cleansing. The temple in Jerusalem dominated religious life, even for those who lived far from the holy city. Temple taxes were required from every Jewish male, regardless of his ability to pay. Pilgrimage festivals brought enormous crowds to Jerusalem, creating chaos, inflated prices, and opportunities for exploitation. The temple hierarchy controlled not just religious practice, but significant economic and political power, making them both revered and resented by the common people. Local synagogues served as community centers, schools, and courts, as well as places of worship. The men who led these institutions wielded enormous influence over daily life, interpreting religious law, settling disputes, and enforcing community standards. Their decisions could make the difference between prosperity and poverty, inclusion and exile, for ordinary families. Marriage negotiations were complex business transactions that could take months or years to complete. Parents began planning their children's marriages when they were still young, carefully considering not just economic factors, but also family reputation, religious observance, and potential political advantages. Love, as modern people understand it, was considered a luxury that few could afford to prioritize over practical considerations. Women had virtually no voice in their own marriage arrangements and might not meet their husbands until their wedding day. Child marriages were common, with girls as young as 12 or 13 becoming wives and mothers. The bride price and dowry negotiations could impoverish families for years, as they struggled to meet the financial obligations required to secure advantageous matches for their children. Divorce, while technically possible under certain circumstances, was devastating for women who had no independent means of support and face social stigma that could make remarriage unlikely. Divorced women often had no choice but to return to their fathers' households, where they became economic burdens that strained already limited resources. Pregnancy and childbirth were times of extreme danger, with mortality rates that would be shocking by modern standards. Women who survived multiple pregnancies often suffered from complications that left them in chronic pain or disability. The lack of medical knowledge meant that conditions that are easily treatable today could lead to death or lifelong suffering. Children who survived infancy faced their own set of challenges. They were expected to contribute to family survival from an early age, with boys as young as 6 or 7 tending flocks or helping with farm work, and girls learning household skills that would prepare them for marriage and motherhood. Education was minimal and practical, focused on the skills needed for survival rather than intellectual development. The constant presence of disease shaped every aspect of life in ways that modern medicine has made us forget. Epidemics could sweep through communities with devastating speed, killing entire families and leaving survivors traumatized and destitute. Common childhood diseases that we now prevent with vaccines claimed countless lives. Even minor injuries could become infected and lead to death in a world without antibiotics or proper surgical techniques. Mental illness was poorly understood and often attributed to spiritual causes. People suffering from what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, or other psychological conditions were often believed to be possessed by demons or cursed by God. Treatment options were limited to prayer, exorcism, or herbal remedies that may have done more harm than good. The elderly, if they survived to old age, faced a precarious existence. With no social safety net beyond family support, they depended entirely on their children's willingness and ability to care for them. In times of scarcity, the old and infirm were often the first to suffer, as families made difficult decisions about how to allocate limited resources. Physical disabilities presented enormous challenges in a society that had no accommodations for those who couldn't perform manual labor. People who were blind, deaf, or unable to walk often had no choice but to become beggars, depending on religious charity for survival. The social stigma attached to disability was compounded by religious beliefs that often interpreted physical impairments as evidence of sin or divine punishment. Travel, even for short distances, was dangerous and exhausting. Roads were rough tracks that became impassable in bad weather. Bandits preyed on travelers, and wild animals posed threats in remote areas. A journey that would take an hour by modern transportation could require days of difficult walking, with travelers carrying their own food and water and sleeping outdoors. Communication across distances was slow and unreliable. News traveled only as fast as the people who carried it, often taking weeks or months to reach remote areas. Important information was frequently distorted by repeated telling, and rumors and misinformation spread easily through communities that had no way to verify what they heard. The economy operated on principles that would seem primitive and inefficient to modern minds. Most transactions were conducted through barter, with money being scarce and coming in confusing varieties. A farmer might trade grain for pottery, pottery for cloth, and cloth for tools, in a complex web of exchanges that required careful negotiation and trust. Markets were chaotic affairs, where buyers and sellers haggled over every transaction. Weights and measures varied from place to place, making trade complicated and creating opportunities for fraud. Quality control was non-existent, and customers had no recourse if they discovered they had been cheated after completing a purchase. Taxation was crushing and arbitrary, with multiple authorities demanding tribute from the same people. Roman taxes, temple taxes, local levies, and customs duties could consume most of a family's income, leaving barely enough for survival. Tax collectors were despised not just for their collaboration with foreign occupiers, but for their tendency to extract more than was owed to line their own pockets. The legal system was a patchwork of Roman law, Jewish religious law, and local customs that often contradicted each other. Justice depended largely on social status, with the wealthy and powerful able to buy favorable outcomes, while the poor faced harsh punishments for minor offenses. Witnesses could be bribed, evidence could be fabricated, and appeals were often impossible. Property rights were insecure, particularly for those without political connections. Land could be seized for unpaid taxes, confiscated as punishment for real or imagined crimes, or simply taken by force by those with enough power to get away with it. Farmers who had worked the same fields for generations could find themselves homeless overnight. The environment itself was hostile in ways that modern technology has made us forget. Droughts could last for years, destroying crops and killing livestock. Floods could wash away entire communities in a matter of hours. Earthquakes were common and devastating, leveling buildings and creating long-term instability. Plagues of locusts could destroy a region's food supply in days. Weather patterns were unpredictable and extreme, with scorching summers and surprisingly cold winters. Without weather forecasting, people had no way to prepare for storms or droughts beyond what their ancestors' experience had taught them. A sudden hailstorm could destroy an entire season's work in minutes. Natural disasters were interpreted through religious lenses, seen as expressions of divine anger or tests of faith. Communities might spend precious resources on religious ceremonies intended to appease angry gods, rather than on practical preparations for future catastrophes. Water was precious and often contaminated. Wells could run dry or become polluted, leaving communities desperate for alternatives. Rivers and streams were shared by humans and animals, making waterborne diseases common. The constant search for clean water consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. Food preservation was a constant challenge in a world without refrigeration. Meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Grain could be attacked by insects or rodents, destroying a family's food supply. Fruits and vegetables were available only in season and had to be carefully managed to prevent spoilage. The tools and technology available were crude by modern standards, but required considerable skill to use effectively. A carpenter worked with hand tools that had to be constantly maintained and sharpened. A farmer's plough was a simple wooden implement that broke frequently and had to be repaired with whatever materials were available. Craftsmanship was valued, but poorly compensated. A skilled potter or weaver might spend days creating a single piece, only to sell it for barely enough to buy food for their family. The market for luxury goods was small, limited to the wealthy few who could afford to pay for quality work. Innovation was rare and often met with suspicion. Traditional methods were preserved not just out of conservatism, but because any change could have catastrophic consequences for families living on the edge of survival. New techniques or tools were adopted slowly and carefully, if at all. As we drift deeper into this gentle exploration of ancient life, we begin to understand how every aspect of existence in first-century Palestine was shaped by challenges that would overwhelm any modern person. The simple act of getting through a single day required physical endurance, mental resilience, and social skills that most of us have never had to develop. Yet somehow, in this harsh and unforgiving world, people not only survived, but created communities, raised families, and found meaning in their lives. They developed rich traditions, told stories that have echoed through the ages, and maintained hope even in the darkest of circumstances. It was into this world that Jesus was born, and it was among these struggling, resilient people that he lived and taught. Understanding their daily reality helps us appreciate not just the challenges they faced, but the remarkable strength of spirit that allowed them to endure and even thrive in conditions that would test the limits of human endurance. The spiritual landscape of first-century Palestine was as treacherous to navigate as its physical terrain, filled with competing authorities, conflicting interpretations, and religious obligations that could trap the unwary in webs of ritual complexity that modern minds would find bewildering. Imagine trying to live a devout life when every action, every word, every thought was subject to scrutiny by multiple religious authorities who might interpret the same law in entirely different ways. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and other religious groups each claimed to represent the true path to God, yet their teachings often contradicted each other on fundamental questions of daily practice. A simple decision about what to eat for dinner could become a theological minefield, with different schools of thought offering conflicting guidance about ritual purity, proper blessings, and acceptable food combinations. The oral law, passed down through generations of rabbis and teachers, had grown into an enormous body of interpretation and commentary that attempted to address every conceivable situation a faithful person might encounter. These teachings weren't written down, but had to be memorized, creating a system where religious knowledge was concentrated in the hands of learned men who could spend their entire lives studying the intricate details of proper observance. For ordinary people, this meant living in constant uncertainty about whether their actions were pleasing to God. The Sabbath, intended as a day of rest and spiritual renewal, had become surrounded by so many restrictions and requirements that it often created more stress than relief. Exactly how far could you walk? What constituted work? Could you help a neighbor in distress? The answers varied depending on which religious authority you consulted. Prayer itself was governed by complex rules about timing, posture, direction, and content. Men were expected to pray at specific times throughout the day, facing Jerusalem, using prescribed words and gestures that had to be performed correctly to be valid. Women's prayers were less regulated, but also less valued, reflecting their secondary status in religious life. The temple in Jerusalem dominated the spiritual horizon, even for those who lived hundreds of miles away. This wasn't just a place of worship, but the center of the entire sacrificial system that was believed necessary to maintain the relationship between God and his people. Every major life event, from birth to death, required specific offerings and ceremonies that could only be performed by authorized priests using ritually pure animals and implements. The journey to Jerusalem for the major festivals was both a spiritual pilgrimage and a grueling physical ordeal. Families would save for months or years to afford the trip, walking for days through dangerous territory, carrying their own food and camping supplies. The city during festival times became a chaotic mass of humanity, with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims crowding into spaces designed for a much smaller population. The temple itself was a marvel of architecture and organization, but it was also a source of corruption and exploitation that would shock modern sensibilities. Money changers charged exorbitant rates to convert foreign currency into the special temple coins required for offerings. Animal sellers inflated prices for sacrificial lambs and doves, knowing that pilgrims had no alternative sources. The priests who controlled these lucrative enterprises lived in luxury, while ordinary worshippers struggled to afford the minimum required offerings. The sacrificial system itself would be deeply disturbing to anyone raised with modern sensibilities about animal welfare. Thousands of animals were slaughtered daily, their blood splashed on altars, their flesh burned or distributed according to complex rules about which portions belonged to God, which to the priests, and which could be consumed by the worshippers. The smell of burning flesh and incense, the sound of bleating animals and chanting priests, the sight of blood running in channels designed to carry it away from the altar areas. All of this created a sensory experience that was overwhelming and alien. For those who couldn't afford to travel to Jerusalem or purchase proper sacrifices, local synagogues provided an alternative form of worship. But these too came with their own challenges and hierarchies. Seating was arranged according to social status, with the wealthy and learned occupying places of honor, while the poor sat in the back or stood outside. Reading from the sacred scrolls was a privilege reserved for men who could demonstrate both literacy and ritual purity. The synagogue leaders wielded enormous power in their communities, serving not just as religious authorities, but as judges, teachers, and arbiters of social disputes. Their interpretations of religious law could determine whether a family was accepted or ostracized, whether a business transaction was considered legitimate, whether a marriage was valid. Challenging their authority was virtually unthinkable for ordinary people who depended on community acceptance for their survival. Women's religious lives were particularly constrained, with their participation limited to observing from segregated areas and fulfilling domestic obligations that were considered forms of worship. They couldn't serve as witnesses in religious courts, couldn't be counted in the minimum number required for certain prayers, and were excluded from most forms of religious education. Their spiritual lives were largely private affairs, conducted within the confines of family and domestic responsibilities. The concept of personal relationship with God, so central to modern religious thinking, was largely mediated through the complex system of priests, rabbis, and religious authorities who controlled access to sacred knowledge and proper ritual observance. Ordinary people might go their entire lives without feeling they had direct communion with the divine, instead experiencing God through the interpretations and instructions of religious leaders who claimed special authority and knowledge. Ritual purity laws created a constant state of anxiety about spiritual contamination that would be exhausting to modern minds. Contact with the dead, certain animals, people with skin diseases, or even normal bodily functions could render a person unclean and require specific purification procedures before they could participate in religious activities. For those whose occupations required them to handle dead animals, work with unclean materials, or interact with ritually impure people, maintaining spiritual purity became nearly impossible. The mikveh, or ritual bath, was an essential part of religious life, but access to proper facilities was limited and expensive. Poor families might go months between opportunities for proper purification, creating a sense of spiritual isolation and unworthiness that affected every aspect of their lives. The water had to meet specific requirements about source, temperature, and method of collection, making it a scarce and precious resource in many communities. Dietary laws governed not just what could be eaten, but how it was prepared, served, and consumed. Meat and dairy products couldn't be mixed. Certain animals were forbidden entirely, and elaborate procedures were required for slaughter and preparation. For families already struggling to find enough food to survive, these restrictions could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Yet violating them was considered a serious sin that could result in community ostracism. The calendar itself was a source of religious complexity, with different groups following different systems for determining festival dates and Sabbath observances. The lunar calendar meant that dates shifted relative to solar seasons, making it difficult to predict when religious obligations would fall. Disputes about calendar calculations could divide communities and create confusion about when to observe important holy days. Tithing requirements demanded a significant portion of already meager incomes, with different authorities claiming rights to various percentages of crops, livestock, and earnings. The temple tithe, the Levitical tithe, the poor tithe, and various other religious obligations could consume most of a family's surplus production, leaving them with barely enough for survival, while religious authorities accumulated wealth and power. The concept of religious merit was tied to external observances and community standing rather than internal spiritual development. Charity was important, but had to be given publicly to count toward one's religious reputation. Prayer was valued, but only if performed correctly according to prescribed formulas. Study of religious texts was considered the highest form of devotion, but it was accessible only to those with the education, leisure time, and social status to participate in scholarly discussions. Religious festivals, while providing moments of joy and community celebration, were also times of increased financial pressure and social anxiety. Families were expected to provide special foods, new clothing, and gifts that they often couldn't afford. The contrast between the wealthy who could celebrate lavishly and the poor who struggled to meet minimum observance requirements created visible reminders of social inequality that undermined the spiritual purposes of these occasions. The mystical aspects of religion that might provide comfort and transcendence were largely hidden from ordinary people, preserved in secret traditions passed down among small groups of initiated scholars. The idea that every person could have direct access to divine wisdom or experience personal revelation was considered dangerous and potentially heretical by established religious authorities. Superstition and folk religion flourished alongside official observances, creating a complex mixture of beliefs and practices that varied from region to region. Amulets, charms, and folk remedies were widely used despite official disapproval, reflecting people's desperate need for protection and healing in a world where both were scarce. The boundaries between acceptable religious practice and forbidden magic were often unclear and subject to interpretation by local authorities. The burden of religious observance fell particularly heavily on those who were already struggling with poverty, illness, or social marginalization. The blind, the lame, those with skin diseases, and others with physical conditions were often excluded from full participation in religious life. Yet they were also blamed for their conditions as evidence of divine displeasement or family sin. This created a cruel double burden, where those who most needed spiritual comfort were least able to access it. Religious education was limited to a small elite who could afford to support sons in years of study while they contributed nothing to family survival. The vast majority of people received only basic instruction in prayers and observances, leaving them dependent on religious authorities for interpretation of complex laws and traditions. This knowledge gap created opportunities for exploitation and made it difficult for ordinary people to challenge religious authorities, even when they abused their power. The political dimensions of religious life added another layer of complexity and danger to spiritual observance. Roman authorities were suspicious of large religious gatherings and popular religious movements that might challenge their control. Jewish religious leaders had to balance their roles as spiritual guides with their positions as intermediaries between the occupying forces and the occupied population. This created conflicts of loyalty and interest that often resulted in religious decisions being made for political rather than spiritual reasons. The expectation of divine intervention in human affairs was both a source of hope and a burden of responsibility that weighed heavily on people's minds. Natural disasters, military defeats, economic hardships, and personal tragedies were all interpreted as signs of divine displeasure that required both individual and communal responses. The constant need to discern God's will and respond appropriately created anxiety and uncertainty that affected every decision and every relationship. Death, while providing release from earthly suffering, brought its own set of religious complexities and anxieties. Proper burial procedures were essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife, but they were expensive and required ritual knowledge that not everyone possessed. Mourning practices were governed by strict rules about timing, behavior, and social interactions, that could isolate grieving families at the times when they most needed community support. The hope of resurrection and eternal life provided comfort to some, but it was also a source of theological debate and uncertainty. Different religious groups held conflicting views about what happened after death, what conditions were necessary for salvation, and how the final judgment would be conducted. For ordinary people trying to live faithful lives, these uncertainties created additional anxiety about whether their efforts would ultimately be rewarded or punished. As night fell over these ancient communities, families would gather for evening prayers that acknowledged both gratitude for surviving another day and anxiety about what tomorrow might bring. The darkness that enveloped their small homes was filled not just with physical dangers, but with spiritual uncertainties that modern people, with their individual relationships with God and personal interpretations of faith, would find overwhelming and oppressive. Yet somehow, in this maze of religious complexity and spiritual burden, people found ways to experience authentic faith, genuine community, and personal encounters with the divine that sustained them through their daily struggles. It was in this challenging spiritual environment that Jesus would emerge, offering teachings that cut through religious complexity to reveal simpler truths about love, mercy, and direct relationship with God that would transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human spiritual development. The contrast between the religious world that existed and the spiritual revolution that was about to unfold becomes even more remarkable when we understand just how deeply entrenched and complex the existing system had become, and how radical it would seem to suggest that ordinary people could find God without navigating all these intricate requirements and hierarchical structures. The economic realities of first-century Palestine would crush the spirit of anyone accustomed to modern financial securities and opportunities for advancement. Imagine waking each morning knowing that a single bad decision, a failed harvest, or an unexpected illness could plunge your entire family into destitution, from which there might be no recovery. This wasn't a world where you could simply find another job, apply for assistance, or declare bankruptcy to start fresh. Economic ruin was often permanent and frequently fatal. Most people lived in what we would now call extreme poverty, though they had no such terminology to describe their condition. They simply accepted that hunger was normal, that owning more than one set of clothes was a luxury, and that any small surplus had to be immediately converted into something that could survive the next crisis. The concept of saving money for future goals was meaningless when survival demanded spending every coin as soon as it was earned. Labor was backbreaking and dangerous, with no safety regulations or compensation for injuries. A stonecutter who lost an eye to flying chips had no insurance to cover medical care or disability payments to support his family. A farmer whose back was broken by a falling tree became an immediate burden on relatives who were already struggling to feed themselves. The injured and disabled often had no choice but to become beggars, sitting by roadsides or temple gates, hoping for coins from passers-by who had little to spare. Wages, when work could be found, were barely sufficient for daily survival. A labourer might earn a denarius for a full day of grueling work under the scorching sun, enough to buy bread for his family, but little else. Women's work was essential, but unpaid, creating a double burden where half the population contributed enormous amounts of labour that generated no income while still requiring food, shelter, and clothing. Seasonal unemployment was a constant threat that hung over most occupations. Agricultural workers might find steady employment during planting and harvest seasons, but face months of idleness during the winter when no outdoor work was possible. Construction projects depended on the whims of wealthy patrons who might cancel plans without warning, leaving crews of workers suddenly without income. Even skilled craftsmen faced periods when demand for their products simply disappeared. The taxation system was designed to extract maximum revenue from the population, with little regard for their ability to pay. Roman taxes, temple taxes, local levies, and customs duties created a crushing burden that often consumed more than half of a family's income. Tax collectors were empowered to seize property, livestock, and even family members as payment for unpaid obligations. The system was deliberately confusing, with multiple overlapping authorities claiming the right to collect different types of taxes from the same people. Debt was a trap that could ensnare entire families for generations. A farmer who borrowed grain to survive a bad harvest might find himself unable to repay when the next crop also failed. Interest rates were usurious, often exceeding 50% annually, making it virtually impossible for borrowers to escape once they fell behind. Debtors could be forced to sell their land, their possessions, and finally themselves and their children into slavery to satisfy their creditors. Land ownership was the only real source of security in this agricultural economy, but it was also precarious and easily lost. Small farmers competed against large estates worked by slave labor, making it difficult to generate enough profit to pay taxes and support their families. A few years of poor harvests, combined with the constant pressure of taxation, could force even established families to sell their ancestral holdings to wealthy landowners who accumulated vast properties, while the former owners became tenant farmers on land their families had once owned. The wealthy, while living in luxury compared to the masses, faced their own forms of economic anxiety. Their fortunes depended on political connections that could shift overnight, trade relationships that could be disrupted by wars or natural disasters, and social networks that required constant maintenance through expensive gifts and entertainments. A merchant who lost a caravan to bandits could see decades of careful accumulation wiped out in a single disaster. Banking, such as it existed, was primitive and unreliable. There were no standardized currencies, with Roman coins, local issues, and foreign money all circulating simultaneously at fluctuating exchange rates. Money changers charged hefty fees for conversion services and often engaged in fraud that was difficult to detect or prosecute. Storing wealth was problematic, with no secure institutions to protect savings from theft, fire, or confiscation. Trade was conducted through complex networks of personal relationships and mutual obligations that could take years to establish and could be destroyed by a single breach of trust. A craftsman who failed to deliver goods as promised might find himself excluded from future business opportunities throughout his region. Reputation was perhaps more valuable than money itself, since economic survival depended on maintaining the confidence of customers, suppliers, and partners. Transportation costs added enormous expenses to any goods that had to be moved beyond local markets. A potter whose work was prized in distant cities might find that the cost of getting his products there consumed most of his potential profits. Merchants who specialized in long-distance trade faced constant risks from bandits, weather, political upheavals, and simple mechanical failures that could strand them in hostile territory with valuable cargo they couldn't protect. Quality control was entirely dependent on individual reputation and customer vigilance. There were no standards for weights and measures, allowing dishonest merchants to cheat customers through false measurements. Food could be adulterated with cheaper ingredients, metals could be diluted with inferior alloys, and textiles could be treated with substances that made them appear more valuable than they actually were. Buyers had to develop expertise in evaluating everything they purchased, and even then, they could easily be deceived. Market days brought entire communities together in chaotic gatherings where fortunes could be made or lost in a few hours of intense bargaining. Farmers would arrive before dawn with whatever surplus they could spare, hoping to sell enough to pay their taxes and buy essential items they couldn't produce themselves. Competition was fierce, with sellers undercutting each other's prices until profit margins disappeared entirely. Seasonal price fluctuations created opportunities for those with storage capacity and capital, but devastating losses for those forced to sell at unfavorable times. Grain prices might triple between harvest and planting seasons, allowing wealthy merchants to profit enormously while poor farmers who had to sell immediately after harvest barely covered their costs. This system concentrated wealth in the hands of those who already had resources while keeping the majority trapped in cycles of poverty. Women faced particular economic disadvantages that would be shocking by modern standards. They couldn't own property independently, couldn't enter into contracts without male relatives' approval, and couldn't engage in most forms of commerce. Widows often found themselves completely destitute, with no legal right to their deceased husband's assets, and no means of supporting themselves or their children. Many had no choice but to remarry quickly, regardless of their personal feelings, simply to avoid starvation. Inheritance laws favoured eldest sons, leaving younger children with minimal resources and forcing them to find their own ways to survive. Daughters received dowries when they married, but these were controlled by their husbands and could be lost through poor management or economic disasters. Family wealth that had been accumulated over generations could be dissipated in a single lifetime through bad decisions, natural disasters, or political upheavals. Professional guilds and trade associations provided some economic protection for their members, but they were also exclusive organizations that limited competition and kept prices artificially high. A young man trying to establish himself as a carpenter might find that established masters refused to sell him tools, teach him advanced techniques, or allow him to work on prestigious projects that could build his reputation. The lack of standardized accounting methods made it difficult for even successful businesses to track their profits and losses accurately. Most transactions were recorded on temporary materials like pottery shards or wax tablets that could be easily altered or destroyed. Long-term financial planning was nearly impossible when there were no reliable methods for calculating returns on investment or predicting future income. Credit was available only through personal relationships and carried enormous risks for both lenders and borrowers. A wealthy landowner might advance grain to tenant farmers before harvest, but if the crops failed, he faced the choice of writing off the debt or forcing families into slavery. Borrowers who defaulted could see their entire extended families held responsible for their obligations, creating conflicts that could divide communities for generations. The absence of insurance meant that any disaster could instantly destroy a lifetime of work. A fire that burned down a workshop, a storm that sank a fishing boat, or a plague that killed livestock could reduce prosperous families to beggary overnight. People developed elaborate networks of mutual support and reciprocal obligations to provide some protection against catastrophic losses. But these informal systems were inadequate for major disasters. Retirement was an unknown concept, with people expected to work until they were physically unable to continue. The elderly who could no longer contribute to family income became burdens that strained household resources. In times of extreme scarcity, difficult decisions had to be made about whether limited food should go to those who could still work or to those who had already given their productive years to family survival. Economic mobility was virtually non-existent, with social and financial status determined almost entirely by birth circumstances. A talented individual might occasionally rise above his origins through exceptional skill, luck, or patronage, but such cases were rare enough to be remembered and discussed for generations. Most people accepted that they would live and die in the same economic circumstances as their parents and grandparents. The religious obligation to give alms to the poor created additional financial pressures on families that were already struggling. While charity was considered a virtue and a religious duty, it also meant that even those living in poverty were expected to share what little they had with others who had even less. This created a complex web of reciprocal obligations that could provide crucial support during crises, but also drained resources during normal times. Seasonal festivals and religious observances required expenditures that many families couldn't afford but couldn't avoid without facing social ostracism. New clothes for children, special foods for celebrations, gifts for relatives and neighbours. All of these expectations added financial pressure to occasions that were supposed to bring joy and spiritual renewal. Families often went into debt to meet these social obligations, creating cycles of borrowing and repayment that lasted for months. The political instability that characterized Roman rule in Palestine created additional economic uncertainties. Rebellions, military campaigns, and changes in administrative policies could disrupt trade routes, alter tax obligations, and destroy local industries without warning. A potter whose work was in demand one year might find his market completely gone the next if political events redirected economic activity to other regions. Currency debasement and inflation, while not understood in modern economic terms, created real hardships for people trying to save money or plan for the future. Coins that contained less precious metal than their face value represented gradually lost purchasing power, making it impossible for ordinary people to accumulate wealth over time. The wealthy could protect themselves by converting money into land or goods, but the poor had no such options. As families gathered around their simple evening meals, sharing whatever food they had managed to acquire during the day, the economic pressures that governed their lives were never far from their thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for failure or modest success, and new decisions about how to allocate scarce resources among competing needs. The constant stress of economic insecurity affected every relationship, every decision, and every hope for the future. Yet somehow, in this harsh economic environment, people found ways to create beauty, express generosity, and maintain hope for better times ahead. They developed intricate systems of cooperation and mutual support that allowed communities to survive disasters that would have destroyed isolated individuals. They created art, music, and literature that celebrated human dignity even in the midst of material deprivation. The economic world that Jesus entered was one where the gap between rich and poor was vast and seemingly unbridgeable, where a few lived in luxury while the majority struggled simply to survive from day to day. His teachings about money, possessions, and economic justice would resonate powerfully with people who understood intimately the corrupting influence of wealth and the desperation of poverty. In this context, his words about the difficulty for rich people to enter heaven and his concern for the poor weren't abstract theological concepts, but practical observations about the economic realities that shaped every aspect of daily life in first-century Palestine. Understanding these economic pressures helps us appreciate not just the material challenges that people faced, but the remarkable faith and resilience they demonstrated in creating meaningful lives despite circumstances that would test the limits of human endurance. Their struggles remind us that economic security, which many modern people take for granted, is a precious gift that should never be assumed to be permanent or universally available. The systems of governance and justice that ruled over first-century Palestine would feel like a nightmare of arbitrary power and crushing bureaucracy to anyone accustomed to modern democratic institutions and legal protections. Imagine living under multiple layers of authority, each with its own laws, courts, and methods of punishment, where your fate could be determined by officials who had never seen you before and cared nothing for your circumstances. At the top of this complex hierarchy sat the Roman emperor, a figure so distant and powerful that he might as well have been a god to the ordinary people of Palestine. His will was transmitted through a chain of governors, prefects, and administrators who wielded absolute authority over life and death. These weren't elected representatives accountable to the people they governed, but appointed officials whose primary loyalty was to Rome and whose main concern was extracting maximum tribute from their territories. The Roman governor, based in Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast, held ultimate judicial authority for serious crimes and disputes involving Roman citizens. But reaching this level of justice required resources, connections, and legal knowledge that were far beyond the reach of ordinary people. Most residents of Palestine were not Roman citizens and had no right to appeal to Roman courts. They existed in a legal limbo where their status depended entirely on the whims of local administrators who might change their policies without warning. Local governance was a confusing patchwork of competing authorities that often worked at cross purposes. Herod and his sons ruled as client kings over different regions, maintaining the pretense of Jewish self-governance while actually serving as Roman puppets. Their courts operated according to a mixture of Jewish law, Roman precedent, and personal preference that made it impossible to predict how any given case might be decided. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem claimed religious authority over all Jews, but their power was limited by Roman oversight and regional politics. They could make decisions about religious law and community discipline, but any punishment involving death or significant property seizure required Roman approval. This created a system where religious authorities could condemn someone but couldn't carry out their own sentences, leading to complex negotiations and political maneuvering that often had little to do with justice. Village elders and local magistrates handled most day-to-day disputes, but their authority was informal and easily overridden by higher officials. A decision that seemed final at the local level could be reversed by a Roman administrator who happened to pass through the area, or by a Herodian official who wanted to demonstrate his power. There was no consistent appeals process and no guarantee that similar cases would be decided in similar ways. The legal system operated on principles that would seem corrupt and unfair to modern sensibilities. Witnesses could be bought, evidence could be fabricated, and judges could be influenced by bribes or political pressure. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, and no protection against self-incrimination. Accused persons were expected to prove their innocence rather than having their guilt demonstrated by prosecutors. Punishments were swift and brutal, designed more to deter others than to provide proportional justice. Crucifixion was a common method of execution for rebels and criminals, deliberately designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. The condemned would hang on wooden crosses for hours or days, slowly suffocating while crowds gathered to watch their agony. Their bodies were often left on display as warnings to others who might consider challenging Roman authority. Lesser crimes were punished with flogging, imprisonment, or forced labor on public works projects. The number of lashes was determined by the judge's assessment of the crime and the criminal's social status, with wealthy defendants often receiving lighter sentences than poor ones for the same offences. Prison conditions were horrific, with inmates crowded into underground cells without adequate food, water, or sanitation. Property crimes carried severe penalties that could destroy entire families. A man caught stealing grain to feed his hungry children might be sentenced to slavery, along with his wife and children, to compensate the victim. There was no consideration of circumstances or motivations. Theft was theft, regardless of whether it was committed out of greed or desperation. Women had virtually no legal standing and couldn't represent themselves in court proceedings. Their testimony was often inadmissible or given less weight than that of men, even when they were the victims of crimes. Cases involving violence against women were typically handled as property disputes between their male relatives and the perpetrators, with the women themselves having no voice in the proceedings. Slavery was not just legally permissible, but was woven into the fabric of the justice system as both a punishment and a form of compensation. Debtors could be enslaved to pay off their obligations, criminals could be sentenced to slavery as punishment, and prisoners of war were automatically enslaved. The treatment of slaves was entirely at the discretion of their owners, with no legal protections against abuse or murder. The concept of rehabilitation was unknown in this system. Punishment was intended to exact retribution, deter future crimes, and demonstrate the power of the authorities. Once someone was labeled a criminal, that stigma followed them for life, making it nearly impossible to reintegrate into normal society even after serving their sentence. Political crimes were treated with particular severity, as any challenge to Roman authority was seen as a threat to the entire imperial system. Merely speaking against Roman rule could result in execution, and entire families could be punished for the actions of one member. Informants were rewarded for reporting seditious speech or behavior, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that poisoned community relationships. Religious disputes often became entangled with civil and criminal law, creating complex cases where theological differences could lead to legal consequences. The Roman authorities generally tried to avoid involvement in Jewish religious matters, but they would intervene when they perceived threats to public order or their own authority. This meant that religious leaders could sometimes use Roman power to settle doctrinal disputes or eliminate rivals. Tax evasion was treated as a serious crime, but the tax system itself was so complex and arbitrary that honest compliance was often impossible. Different authorities claimed the right to collect various types of taxes from the same people, and the rates and methods of calculation changed frequently without notice. Tax collectors were empowered to seize property and arrest individuals on suspicion of underpayment, creating opportunities for abuse and corruption. Border controls and movement restrictions limited people's ability to escape unjust treatment by relocating to other regions. Travelers needed permits and documentation that were expensive and difficult to obtain. Refugees from persecution in one area often found themselves subject to arrest and return to face punishment. The idea of seeking asylum or protection from oppressive authorities was essentially meaningless. The military served as both police force and judicial system in many areas, with soldiers empowered to arrest, try, and punish civilians for a wide range of offences. These weren't trained law enforcement officers, but combat troops who often viewed the local population as potential enemies. Their methods were harsh, and their understanding of local customs and laws was minimal. Collective punishment was commonly used to maintain order, with entire communities held responsible for the actions of individuals. If a village couldn't produce a suspected criminal, everyone might face penalties. If tax collections fell short of expectations, additional levies might be imposed on whole regions. This created pressure for communities to police themselves and turn in troublemakers, but it also fostered resentment and resistance. Legal proceedings were conducted in languages that most defendants didn't understand, with no provision for translation or explanation of the charges against them. Latin was the language of Roman law, Greek was used for commercial and administrative purposes, and Aramaic was the common language of the people. A farmer accused of a crime might find himself tried in Latin before judges who spoke only Greek, with no way to understand what was happening to him. The appeals process, when it existed at all, was expensive and time-consuming, requiring travel to distant cities, and the services of advocates who charged fees that most people couldn't afford. By the time an appeal could be heard, the original sentence might already have been carried out, making the entire process meaningless for all but the wealthiest defendants. Corruption was so pervasive that it was simply accepted as a normal part of how the system operated. Judges expected gifts from parties appearing before them. Administrators demanded bribes to process routine paperwork, and guards required payment to provide even basic necessities to prisoners. Those who couldn't pay these informal fees found themselves at a severe disadvantage in any legal proceeding. The death penalty was used liberally for crimes that modern societies would consider relatively minor. Robbery, adultery, blasphemy, and various forms of political dissent could all result in execution. The methods of execution were deliberately brutal, designed to terrorize potential criminals and demonstrate the power of the state. Public executions drew large crowds and served as grim entertainment, as well as warnings. Legal precedent was inconsistent and often ignored, with each judge free to interpret laws according to his own understanding or preferences. Similar cases might receive completely different outcomes depending on who heard them, when they were tried, and what political pressures were operating at the time. This unpredictability made it impossible for people to know what behavior was safe and what might lead to prosecution. Civil disputes between private parties were supposed to be handled through arbitration or local courts, but these systems were easily corrupted by wealth and influence. A poor farmer in a dispute with a wealthy landowner had little chance of receiving fair treatment, regardless of the merits of his case. The arbitrators were typically drawn from the local elite, who had their own relationships and obligations that influenced their decisions. Property rights were theoretically protected by law, but in practice they could be overridden by political necessity or administrative convenience. Land could be confiscated for public works projects, military needs, or simple administrative error, with compensation that was inadequate or never paid at all. Families could lose ancestral holdings through bureaucratic decisions that they had no power to challenge. The concept of due process was unknown, with arrests, trials, and punishments often occurring in rapid succession without adequate time for defense preparation. Accused persons might be seized in the night, tried at dawn, and executed by noon, with no opportunity to gather witnesses, consult advisors, or even understand the charges against them. Mental illness and intellectual disability provided no protection from prosecution or punishment. Someone who committed a crime while suffering from what we would now recognize as severe psychological disturbance was treated the same as any other criminal. There was no concept of diminished capacity or temporary insanity that might mitigate punishment. International law was essentially the law of the strongest, with Rome imposing its will on weaker peoples through military force. Treaties and agreements could be broken whenever it suited Roman interests, and there was no higher authority to which aggrieved parties could appeal. Subject peoples had no rights that Rome was bound to respect. As darkness fell over these ancient communities, families would gather behind locked doors, speaking in whispers about the injustices they had witnessed and the fears they harbored about their own vulnerability to arbitrary punishment. The absence of reliable legal protection created an atmosphere of chronic anxiety that affected every aspect of daily life. People learned to avoid drawing attention to themselves, to accept unfair treatment rather than risk worse consequences, and to place their hope not in earthly justice, but in divine intervention. The legal and political environment that Jesus encountered was one where power was concentrated in the hands of a few who used it primarily to benefit themselves and maintain their control over others. His teachings about justice, mercy, and the kingdom of heaven would resonate powerfully with people who had experienced firsthand the corruption and brutality of earthly kingdoms. In this context, his promise of a different kind of authority, one based on love rather than fear, service rather than domination, offered hope to those who had little reason to expect fair treatment from human institutions. Understanding these oppressive political and legal realities helps us appreciate not just the courage required to speak truth to power in such circumstances, but the revolutionary nature of a message that proclaimed the equal worth and dignity of all people, regardless of their social status or political connections. For those living under systems designed to crush the spirit and exploit the vulnerable, the promise of divine justice and ultimate accountability for earthly rulers carried a weight and urgency that would be difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. Yet perhaps no aspect of first-century Palestinian life would prove more shocking to modern sensibilities than the complete absence of what we consider basic human rights and personal freedoms. The very concept of individual autonomy that forms the foundation of contemporary society simply did not exist in this ancient world, where every person's identity, opportunities, and ultimate fate were determined by circumstances entirely beyond their control. From the moment of birth, your entire life trajectory was fixed by factors you had no power to influence. Your gender determined whether you would have any voice in society or remain forever subject to male authority. Your family's social status decided what occupations you could pursue, whom you could marry, and how others would treat you. Your place of birth established which laws would govern you, which taxes you would pay, and which authorities could claim power over your life and death. The notion of choosing your own path, pursuing your dreams, or reinventing yourself was not just impractical, but literally unthinkable. A farmer's son would become a farmer, barring extraordinary circumstances. A craftsman's daughter would marry another craftsman and spend her life in domestic service. A slave's children would be born into slavery with no hope of freedom, except through the arbitrary kindness of their owners. Even the most basic decisions that modern people take for granted required permission from various authorities. Where you could live, how you could earn money, whom you could associate with, what you could say in public. All of these were subject to oversight by family heads, community leaders, religious authorities, or government officials who had the power to approve or forbid your choices. Privacy, as we understand it today, was completely unknown. Extended families lived in single rooms where every conversation could be overheard, every action observed, and every emotion scrutinized. Personal space was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford, and even they lived surrounded by servants, slaves, and relatives who monitored their activities. The idea of having time alone to think, reflect, or simply be yourself was foreign to a society where survival depended on constant cooperation and mutual surveillance. Freedom of movement was severely restricted by practical and legal barriers that would feel suffocating to anyone accustomed to modern mobility. Most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, not by choice, but because travel was dangerous, expensive, and often prohibited. Roads were controlled by bandits or military forces. Lodging was scarce and unsafe, and carrying enough supplies for a journey required resources that few possessed. The concept of leisure time, hours or days when you could pursue your own interests without regard for survival needs, was meaningless to people whose every waking moment was consumed by the struggle to stay alive. Children began working as soon as they could walk. Adults labored from dawn to dusk every day except the Sabbath, and the elderly continued contributing whatever they could until death claimed them. Recreation existed only in the form of brief celebrations during religious festivals, and even these were governed by strict traditions that left little room for personal preference. Educational opportunities were limited to a tiny elite who could afford to support non-productive family members during years of study. The vast majority of people remained illiterate throughout their lives, dependent on others to read documents, interpret laws, and handle any business requiring written records. This created a fundamental inequality between those who could access written knowledge and those who remained trapped in cycles of ignorance and exploitation. The foods you could eat, the clothes you could wear, the work you could do, all of these were regulated by religious laws, social customs, and economic realities that left little room for personal taste or preference. Dietary restrictions eliminated entire categories of food, regardless of availability or nutritional value. Dress codes indicated social status and religious affiliation in ways that made individual expression dangerous or impossible. Occupational guilds controlled who could learn various trades and how they could practice them. Women faced restrictions that would be inconceivable to modern minds. They couldn't own property, enter into contracts, serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, or make decisions about their own bodies and lives. Their value was measured primarily in terms of their ability to produce male heirs, and their security depended entirely on maintaining the favor of the men who controlled them. A woman's reputation could be destroyed by rumors or accusations that she had no power to refute, and the consequences could extend to her entire family for generations. Children had no protection from abuse, exploitation, or abandonment by adults who saw them primarily as economic assets or burdens. Parents could sell their children into slavery to pay debts, arrange marriages for daughters who were barely past childhood, or simply abandon infants they couldn't afford to raise. The mortality rates were so high that emotional attachment to children was often delayed until they had survived the most dangerous early years. Freedom of speech and expression were concepts that would have seemed not just impossible, but dangerous to people living under multiple levels of authoritarian control. A careless word could result in charges of blasphemy, sedition, or social disruption that carried severe penalties. Political criticism was essentially treason. Religious questioning was heresy, and social commentary that challenged established hierarchies was grounds for ostracism or worse. The justice system provided no protection for individual rights because the concept of inherent human dignity was foreign to societies organized around power, tradition, and survival. People were valued according to their usefulness to family, community, and state, not because of any intrinsic worth they possessed as human beings. Those who couldn't contribute, the disabled, the elderly, the chronically ill, existed at the mercy of others who might or might not choose to support them. Economic freedom was limited to choosing between different forms of exploitation and hardship. A farmer could decide which crops to plant, but only within the constraints of soil, climate, available seeds, and market demands that left few real options. A craftsman could choose which techniques to use, but only among those approved by his guild and accepted by customers who had their own limited resources and conservative preferences. The absence of social mobility meant that people were trapped not just by their circumstances, but by their expectations. The idea of improving your condition through effort, education, or innovation was foreign to societies where change was viewed with suspicion and tradition was valued above progress. Those rare individuals who managed to rise above their origins were often viewed as threats to social stability rather than examples to be emulated. Religious freedom was perhaps the most restricted of all, with every aspect of spiritual life governed by authorities who claimed divine sanction for their interpretations and requirements. Personal relationships with God were mediated through complex hierarchies of priests, rabbis, and religious officials who controlled access to sacred knowledge and proper worship. Questioning established religious teachings was not just dangerous, but considered spiritually damaging to entire communities. The constant surveillance and social control that characterized daily life created an atmosphere of chronic stress and anxiety that would be overwhelming to modern minds, accustomed to privacy and autonomy. Every action was observed, every word was remembered, and every deviation from accepted norms was noted and potentially punished. People learned to suppress their true thoughts and feelings, presenting facades that conformed to social expectations while hiding their authentic selves. Family relationships that modern people might find supportive and nurturing were often sources of additional pressure and constraint. Parents arranged their children's futures without consulting their preferences. Siblings competed for limited resources and parental favor, and extended relatives had claims on individual decisions that took precedence over personal desires. Love and affection existed within these relationships, but they were always secondary to practical considerations of survival and social standing. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural societies created periods of intense labor, followed by times of enforced idleness that people had no power to change. Farmers might work 18-hour days during harvest season, then face months of winter when outdoor work was impossible and food stores dwindled steadily. These cycles were determined by weather and climate, not by human choice or planning. Even sleep was not entirely under personal control, with family members sharing sleeping spaces where snoring, movement, and various bodily functions disrupted rest for everyone. The lack of adequate heating and lighting meant that sleep patterns were largely determined by sunrise and sunset, regardless of individual preferences or needs. Night brought dangers that required vigilance even during rest periods. The foods available for consumption were determined by season, weather, economic status, and religious law, rather than personal taste or nutritional knowledge. People ate what they could get when they could get it, often consuming the same basic foods day after day for months at a time. Variety was a luxury that few could afford, and even the wealthy were limited by preservation methods and transportation capabilities. Communication beyond immediate family and neighbors was slow, unreliable, and often impossible. People lived in isolation from events and ideas that might have expanded their understanding or provided alternatives to their current circumstances. News from distant places arrived months late and often distorted, leaving communities trapped in local perspectives and traditions that went unchallenged by outside influences. The medical care available was primitive and often harmful, with treatments based on superstition and tradition rather than scientific understanding. People suffering from illness or injury had little choice but to accept whatever remedies local healers could provide, often enduring treatments that worsened their conditions. Mental illness was particularly poorly understood, with sufferers often blamed for their conditions and excluded from normal social participation. Transportation was limited to walking or, for the wealthy, riding animals that were slow, uncomfortable, and required constant care. A journey that modern people could complete in hours might take days or weeks, with travelers exposed to weather, bandits, and various dangers that made every trip a risky undertaking. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace throughout their entire lives. The absence of artificial lighting meant that productive activities were limited to daylight hours, with evenings spent in darkness, relieved only by expensive and dangerous oil lamps or candles. This created long periods of enforced inactivity during winter months, when families huddled together in cold, dark homes with little to do but wait for spring. Climate and weather controlled every aspect of life in ways that modern people, protected by technology and infrastructure, can barely imagine. A drought could destroy an entire year's work and condemn families to starvation. Floods could wash away homes and possessions that represented generations of accumulated wealth. Storms could kill people and animals while destroying crops and buildings that couldn't be easily replaced. The political instability that characterized the ancient world meant that people lived under constant threat of war, rebellion, and administrative changes that could alter their circumstances without warning. Armies could march through peaceful communities, demanding supplies and conscripting young men. New rulers could impose different laws and taxes that disrupted established patterns of life. Border changes could transform loyal citizens into foreign subjects overnight. Currency and economic systems were unstable and often changed without notice, making it difficult for people to plan for the future or accumulate wealth that would retain its value. Trade relationships that families depended on for survival could be disrupted by political events, natural disasters, or simple changes in fashion and demand that were beyond anyone's control. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through this ancient world, we begin to understand why life in first-century Palestine would indeed prove impossible for any modern person to endure. Every aspect of existence that we take for granted, our freedoms, our choices, our securities, our comforts, was absent from a world where survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. Yet in this harsh and unforgiving environment, remarkable people not only endured, but found ways to create meaning, beauty, and hope that have echoed through the centuries. They developed rich traditions of storytelling, music, and art that celebrated human dignity even in the midst of overwhelming challenges. They created communities bound by love and mutual support that sustained individuals through unimaginable hardships. They maintained faith in divine justice and ultimate redemption that gave meaning to lives that might otherwise have seemed unbearably difficult. Understanding the realities of this ancient world helps us appreciate not just how far human civilization has progressed, but how precious and fragile our modern freedoms and securities truly are. It reminds us that the comfort, safety, and opportunities we enjoy today are the result of countless generations of struggle, innovation, and sacrifice by people who dreamed of better lives for their descendants. Most importantly, it helps us understand the revolutionary nature of the message that emerged from this harsh environment, a message of love, mercy, and hope that promised dignity and worth to every human being regardless of their circumstances. In a world where power, wealth, and social status determined a person's value, the radical claim that all people were beloved children of God offered a transformation of human understanding that continues to shape our world today. So as you drift off to peaceful sleep tonight, secure in your warm bed, surrounded by the comforts and freedoms that protect you from the harsh realities our ancestors faced, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable journey that has brought humanity from that difficult ancient world to the relative peace and prosperity many of us enjoy today. And perhaps, in your dreams, you might catch a glimpse of the courage, faith, and resilience that enabled ordinary people to survive extraordinary challenges while laying the foundation for the better world we inherit. Rest well, dear listener, knowing that while you wouldn't last a day in the time of Jesus, the people who did survive that challenging era have left us gifts of wisdom, faith, and hope that continue to enrich our lives today. Their struggles remind us never to take our blessings for granted, and their triumphs inspire us to face our own challenges with similar courage and determination. Until we meet again on another journey through history's quiet corners, may your dreams be filled with gratitude for the present and hope for the future. Good night and sweet dreams of gentler times. The first light of dawn creeps softly over the Galilean hills, painting the rugged landscape in muted shades of gold and lavender. The air is still cool, carrying with it the faint scent of olive groves and the distant smoke of early morning fires. Somewhere, a cock crows, its call sharp and insistent, cutting through the lingering silence of the night. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the village begins to stir. You awaken on your thin straw pallet, muscles stiff from yesterday's labours. Around you, the soft breathing of family members fills the one-room dwelling. Outside, a low murmur grows, voices rising and falling as neighbours prepare for the day. You push back the woven mat that serves as a door and step out into the narrow, dusty street. The chill of the packed earth beneath your bare feet sends a shiver up your spine. The marketplace is your destination, the heart of the village, where life pulses most vividly and where survival itself is negotiated in countless small exchanges. You clutch a small leather pouch in your hand. Inside, a few worn coins jangle softly, their weight light enough to remind you of their scarcity, yet heavy with the decisions they represent. Every coin is a choice: food, oil, thread, or perhaps nothing at all if prices are too high. As you approach, the air grows thicker with sound and scent. Wooden carts creak under the weight of their burdens as donkeys pull them over uneven ground. Merchants call out in loud sing-song voices, their words overlapping in a chaotic symphony of offers, promises, and demands. Women argue over the price of lentils, their voices sharp with urgency. Children dart between legs, giggling as they clutch pieces of stale bread or chase after stray chickens. The marketplace itself is little more than an open square, flanked by low stone buildings and shaded by makeshift awnings of faded linen and palm fronds. Stalls are rough wooden tables, some no more than mats spread on the ground, displaying goods that range from the meagre to the miraculous. You pause near a potter's stall, where rows of clay vessels are stacked in precarious towers. Their surfaces are rough, unglazed, their shapes slightly uneven, each bearing the unmistakable imprint of human hands. The potter himself is a stooped man, his skin leathery from years spent in the sun, his fingernails permanently stained with reddish clay. He sits cross-legged, deftly shaping a small jar on a foot-powered wheel, the soft whirring sound blending with the hum of the market. His eyes flick briefly toward you, measuring your intent before returning to his work. Further along, the scent of fresh bread draws you toward a baker's stall. Flat rounds of barley loaves lie stacked in neat piles, their surfaces pocked and uneven from cooking on hot stones. The aroma is intoxicating, but the price, whispered quietly by the baker's wife, makes your stomach knot. You weigh your coins in your hand, doing silent calculations. If you buy bread today, there may be no oil for the lamp tonight. A fishmonger's stall assaults your senses next. Salted fish hang in bunches from wooden beams, their scales dulled and their odour pungent in the morning air. Flies buzz lazily around them, and the fishmonger waves them away with a frayed reed fan as he shouts prices to passers-by. His voice is rough from years of shouting over the din of the market. A woman with a crying infant slung across her back argues fiercely over the cost of a small perch, her desperation plain to everyone within earshot. At a weaver's stall, bolts of rough linen in muted earth tones are neatly rolled and stacked. The weaver, a wiry woman with strong arms and calloused fingers, unrolls a small piece to show its tight weave and durability. She explains, almost wearily, how the fabric will last through years of hard use, if it's cared for properly. You run your fingers over the cloth, feeling its coarse texture, imagining how many months of careful saving it would take to afford even a single tunic. Throughout the square, the sounds and sights swirl around you. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer shaping crude iron tools, the bray of a restless donkey tethered to a post, the metallic jingle of a money changer's scales, as he measures silver denarii with practiced speed. His hands move so quickly, it's impossible to tell if his measurements are fair. But in a world where few can read or count, trust is often the only currency. Roman soldiers stride through the crowd, their armor catching the morning light. The crowd subtly parts for them, voices lowering as they pass. Their presence is a reminder of power, not protective, but oppressive. A merchant bows slightly, more from fear than respect. The soldiers say nothing, but their eyes scan the crowd, lingering a moment too long on a group of young men loitering near the well. A beggar sits near the edge of the square, his legs twisted from some long-ago injury. His palm is outstretched, his eyes downcast. Few spare him a glance. Charity is a religious obligation, but with so many mouths to feed at home, most keep their coins hidden in the folds of their garments. You catch the scent of crushed herbs as you pass a healer's stall. Small clay jars and bundles of dried plants are arrayed neatly on a worn mat. The healer, an elderly woman with bright, alert eyes, watches you as you glance at her wares. Her remedies are for ailments of the body and spirit alike, but whether they truly heal or only offer comfort. No one can say for certain. The marketplace hums with life, but beneath the surface, there's a tension born of scarcity and survival. Every transaction is a quiet battle, every smile tinged with calculation, every gesture measured for its potential cost or gain. As the sun climbs higher, the heat begins to rise off the packed earth in shimmering waves. The market's tempo quickens, voices growing sharper, tempers shorter. Chickens squawk in alarm as they're gathered up for sale, and the cries of infants mingle with the steady rhythm of negotiation. Somewhere nearby, a dispute erupts over water rights, voices rising until a village elder intervenes, his tone weary but firm. You clutch your small purchases to your chest, a few barley loaves, a handful of dried figs, and a cracked clay jar for carrying water. It's not much, but it will keep your family going another day. As you turn toward the road that will lead you back to your home, you cast one last look over your shoulder at the bustling square. It is both heart and lifeblood of your village, a place of hope, struggle, and unspoken fear. Tomorrow, you will return again, your pouch a little lighter, your choices no easier. But for now you walk away, the sound of the marketplace fading behind you as the day's heat settles in.